Welcome to the Lippert Technical Training Institute. My name's Chet Dellenbeck. Today we're going to be going over the procedure for rebuilding an inverted Schwintek slide-out system. The gear racks that we have available for those are a standard rebuild kit, which comes with both upper and lower gear rack assemblies that are 42 3/4 inches long. It also comes with both your V-rollers, your snap rings, your shoes, your rivets, and the foam wear pads. Now you can get the wear pad section of this separate. This is a basic rebuild kit. It does not include the actual gear racks. Also, in addition to that, we have a standard bearing block replacement that comes with both the upper and the lower bearing block and both sets of rivets. The tools that are required for this procedure: a pair of snap ring pliers, various picks, a utility knife to cut the seal on the H column, a flathead screwdriver, either a battery-powered drill or a battery-powered screw gun with appropriate bit, a rubber mallet, a block of wood, a floor jack, and also your safety glasses. So safety is very important whenever you're working on a slide out. The first thing is make sure you have your proper PPE, personal protection equipment on. Also, whenever you back that unit in, make sure it's on a level surface and the coach is level itself. Make sure the slide out is clear. Make sure there's no obstructions that are going to prevent you from being able to extend or retract the slide out as necessary. Also, once you have that slide out part way out and you're ready to go ahead and start removing the column, that you support the weight of the slide out with a floor jack. So on this mock-up, we've already determined that we need to remove the H column and rebuild it. The process we used for this was we took the measurements from the face of the gear rack to the outside edge of the H column and determined that this one is out of tolerance. It's 2.5 inches, plus or minus an 1/8 inch is the proper tolerance. This one's just slightly out. Also, when we were looking at that, we did notice there was excessive damage to the gear rack itself, both on the upper and the lower. It does have a broken shoe on it, and the seal is actually getting pulled into the gear rack also. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to start the removal process of this gear rack, and then we're going to get it put on the table. So the first step in this process is to fully retract the slide out. Go ahead and remove the first 3 sets of screws on the upper and the lower gear rack. So we'll simply come in, and then we would go ahead and continue on the lower gear rack. The next step in the procedure is to go ahead and run that slide out. Leave about 8 inches of it retracted, and then we're going to support the weight with the floor jack. So we simply hit extend. This slide out is fairly shallow, so we don't have to run it out as far as you might. We're going to take the floor jack, slide up underneath it, and once again, we want to make sure that we do not lift the room. We just simply support the room. So now that we have the slide out and we have it supported, we're going to take our block of wood and place it between your exterior sidewall and your exterior fascia, setting just like this. The next step in the H column removal is to pull the wiring harness from the motor itself. So we're simply going to reach in here, grip the harness, and then pull the motor separate from the harness. So the next step is, once we've disconnected the motor from the harness, we're going to use a utility knife and we're going to cut the seal on the H column. So we'll simply come in, get it in there, cut the seal up to free that H column from the sidewall of the unit. So now that we have the seal cut, the next step is we're going to go ahead and remove all the screws out of the H column from top to bottom, leaving the last set of screws in the gear rack. The next step is we're going to take a jumper harness, which is nothing more than a motor harness that we have stripped back the red and black wires on here, and put a couple spade connectors on here. We need a power source. We're going to come over, We're going to pull out our motor harness, plug our motor harness into our jumper harness, make sure your block stays in the right position. And then we're simply going to take and we're going to connect this to the battery. When you do this, make sure that you bump it, that you don't just push it in there and hold it in there. So you just want to bump this. And as you can see, what's happening is since that slide out cannot retract because of the 2x4 on the top of the roof, the H-column is being forced out of the opening. So now that the H-column is outside of this opening, the very next step is we're going to go ahead and remove the rest of the screws from the upper and lower gear rack assembly. We'll simply remove these. Remove the lower one. If the gear rack was sticking, we would need to get in behind it with a putty knife, being careful not to damage the sidewall. Once you have it, you simply grip it and pull it out and slide it past your exterior fascia. Now you can go ahead, walk it over to the table and set it down, and then we're going to start the disassembly and inspection next. All right, so now we have the H-column on the table. The next step is going to be to go ahead and use a square bit, and we're going to remove the motor retention screw from the column itself. Once we have the motor retention screw removed, the next step is going to be remove the motor. The coupler will more than likely come out with the motor as well. Now we can move on to disassembly. So the disassembly process for this is fairly straightforward and simple. If the system, there are two rivets on either side, the upper and the lower, and on the inside edge as well. If those are already separated like this one, you can just lift this column right straight out, set your H column to the side, and then you can go ahead, slide these together, and remove your gear racks from the system simply by pulling them toward you or pushing them away. All right, once you have your gear racks removed, set those off for inspection. And now we're going to take the rest of the system apart. So what we're going to do is just pull the torque shaft out the top of the gear rack, or the bearing blocks themselves, separate the bearing blocks and the spur gears. So part of the inspection is determining whether or not the system can be rebuilt. The first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at the H column itself. When we look at the H column, what we're looking for is damage to the actual H column. Is it twisted? Are there any significant scars, bends, or bows to the H column? Also, we want to make sure that the gibs are in good condition. They're solid, they're not moving, they're not rocking back and forth, and also that the rivets that hold the gibs in place are intact. If any of those are missing, either the gibs, the gib rivets, or the H column's damaged, you're going to want to replace the entire system. Along with that, when you look at the torque shaft, what you want to make sure is the torque shaft's in good condition. This has a little bit of wear on it, but it's not that significant. If this torque shaft was damaged, bent, or if the ends were stripped out where the spur gear rides, then we'd want to also replace the entire system. Because once you get damage to either the torque shaft or the H column, generally you will have enough accumulative damage that it warrants a system replacement. The next step is to go in and look at the individual components, like the coupler. You want to make sure that the coupler is intact, that there's no cracks, no rust, or anything along that line on the coupler itself. The two spur gears, when you look at these, you want to make sure that there are no cracks, no missing teeth, that they are in good shape. And also, just a side note, make sure that when you reinstall this, which we'll talk about later, but you want those rings to face down and you want the flat portion of that coupler to face up. When you're looking at the wear and tear on the gear racks, what you're looking for is to see, instead of a nice flat surface like this, those teeth are pointed, they're broken, maybe they're dished out, like looks like somebody took a spoon and scooped them out, things along that line. Inspecting both of these, the upper and the lower, both of these look like they're in good shape, so we're going to go ahead and reinstall these on the system when we do a rebuild kit. So now we're going to take apart the upper and the lower bearing block assembly. We start this process with a pair of snap ring pliers. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull that snap ring off. Be careful when you pull the snap rings off, because if you put too much tension on there, they can actually shoot across the shop and they're very difficult to find. We're also going to remove the V-roller. We're going to take a pick, and on the top edge of this, and I'll show you on this one, what we're going to do is there are two little tabs for this inverted system. We're going to reach up in here. Oops. We're going to pop that tab loose carefully. And then we're going to come to the opposite side. And I'm not left-handed, so this will be interesting. Pop this one loose. And then we can go ahead and wiggle that shoe back and forth and pop it off of here. Sometimes it's beneficial to have a flat blade screwdriver so that you can work it underneath the shoe to carefully pry it up and off from the foot itself. And then we're going to repeat the same process on the upper ones. So on the lower bearing block assembly, we're going to go ahead and do the same procedure. We're going to remove the snap ring. Remove the snap ring, set it to the side, remove the V-roller. If you look at this V-roller, there is a flat spot on this V-roller. This is one of the reasons why we are doing the rebuild kit, is because there is a flat spot on this one. I'm going to set that to the side. What is really important on this is when you look at the shoe. On an inverted gear rack system, what you're going to have is you're going to have these two tabs. This one right here and this one right here. That holds that shoe to the foot. And once we have them slightly raised, I need to raise this one a little bit more. We can come in here with a flat blade screwdriver and carefully work these off. And there we go. Now I've got it removed and the foot is exposed. Now what I want you to look at on this foot, if you look at this, it's difficult to see, but if I put that straight edge across there, you can see that that foot is bent. This corner of that foot is actually bent down so that it's not straight. All right, this is the primary reason that we are going to replace both the upper and the lower bearing block assembly when we do the rebuild kit. It is always recommended that if you just replace one, you replace the other as well, because they work in pairs. So I went ahead and I brought the gear racks back over here because in case the gear racks are damaged, so for example, if this gear rack was all chewed up and marred up and we needed to replace it, I wanted to show you how to properly measure and cut one of these. So all you're going to do is take your bare gear rack and measure it. This one happens to be 16.5 inches. Keep in mind, this was designed for that specific mock-up. So I take that 16.5 inches and I transfer it to my full-size ones that I got in the repair kit. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to mark at 16.5 inches. You can cut it with a chop saw, a miter saw, anything that's going to give you a nice straight cut. Once you have it cut to that 16.5 inches, you're going to have to go through and deburr it. When you cut aluminum, you have a chance of creating burrs, so you just want to file those off so it's nice and smooth. So what I have here is I have the replacement kit for the upper and lower bearing blocks. I also have my basic rebuild kit, and we're going to go ahead and talk about how to properly install these. All right, so when I pull everything out of here, set the bag to the side. Here's the foam plugs we talked about at the beginning. If I was using the gear racks, these would have to go back into the gear racks. My new V-rollers. My two new shoes. Oops, let's get those squared up. Two new rivets and two new snap rings. All right, so when I'm doing the installation on here, what I'm looking at is just like we talked about before. Always look at your new components. Do a visual inspection just to ensure that everything's good. The V-roller arm here looks fine on this one. That foot is nice and square. It's not bent or damaged, so we'll go ahead and start the installation. So first things first, just drop your V-roller on there, grab your snap ring and your snap ring pliers, carefully squeeze them. The next step is to go ahead and install your shoe. So when you install the shoe on here, all you're going to do is take these two tabs, you're going to put them toward the top with the flat portion on the bottom, slide it in place, and then press down. Sometimes it does help to reach inside of here with a pick to raise this up, because we are going to have to lift these tabs. Be very careful when you're lifting these tabs though. That tab has to be set so that this entire surface right here is nice and flush. So all I'm going to do for that is come in here, take a screwdriver, and I'm just going to push down on these two tabs. So we're going to do the same thing on the lower. All right, so now we're ready to reassemble the inverted gear rack system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my upper bearing block. I'll start with this one first. And just like I talked about at the beginning, you've got this ring on this spur gear. That needs to face down toward the V-roller when it's installed into here. And then I simply am going to take my torque shaft. I'm going to line everything up. And drop it right in there. And there's a little crimp on the end of the torque shaft, the upper portion of that torque shaft, that will stop that from going any higher. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom. Once again, making sure that ring is facing down toward the bottom of that V-roller. So when I install this, simply get it on there, align it. Well, almost had it. There it goes. All right. That took a little bit longer than expected, but now my upper and my lower bearing block assembly and my spur gears are installed. So now I'm going to install them into my H column. So a little tip on this is just to hold down on your upper. And when you align your upper with your gibs, you set it in there, and then you pull your lower one in until the entire system drops into place. At this point, we're going to go ahead and put the rivets back in. So we lift this up, and this is a float side, which is your right-hand side as you're looking at the outside of the unit. So I'm just going to align these pins. We'll put the plastic rivet in the top. All right, so then we're just going to also install the plastic rivet into lower bearing block assembly. And now the system is ready to be timed. So all we're going to do for timing is we'll take this, flip it so it faces away from us, set it right on the table. We'll take our upper gear rack assembly, we'll slide it in. See how nice and easy that slid in? That's because those tabs are pressed down properly. We'll do the same thing on the lower. And now you'll notice that this system is not timed. This one is set, this one is higher. The process for retiming these is to simply grab this torque shaft, lift up until both of these ratchet. See how neither one of these are moving? Once neither one of these are moving, I take both fingers, wiggle, and push down. And what you'll do then is just measure from here to here to ensure that these are equal. Other than that, you simply take it, set it about halfway, and now you're ready to reinstall your system. All right, so now that we have the upper and lower gear rack installed and timed, the next step is we're going to come around here. I'm going to set this down, and what we're going to install is the coupler. So we're going to take the coupler with the cross section facing down. We're going to drop it in here, turn it, and give it a little push, and it should recess right past that upper bearing block. So it should be slightly recessed in that area. That is how it is properly installed. This is going to make installing the motor much easier. Okay, so now we've got the system prepped. I've got it setting over next to the mock-up. What we're going to do is I'm just going to grab the motor retention screw, the proper bits, the tape measure, and my screw gun. We're going to walk over. We'll set everything right up here where I can easily access it. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to install the system. So just like when we removed it, the first thing we want to do is you want this about halfway. We're simply going to slide it into the opening and then pull it forward. We're going to start with the lower gear rack. We're going to lift up on the lower gear rack till the bottom of the lower gear rack is flush with the bottom of the slide out. We're going to get the screws started. And then we're going to run it in. We're going to put a couple screws in just like this, making sure once again that we hold up on that lower gear rack assembly. You want to make sure also that when you put the screws in, you go straight in. Once you have a couple in the bottom, the next step will be to go ahead, take your tape measure, and we're going to measure between our upper and our lower gear rack to ensure that they are within 1/8 inch of parallel. All right, that's 40 inches. And I'm going to do it on the inside without moving the gear rack. That is at 40 inches, so we're good to go ahead and reattach the screws. If the screw holes don't line up, don't worry about it. But since we're using the original upper and lower gear rack assembly, the screw holes do line up on this particular one. A couple more in here on the bottom. Now we're going to remove the block from the top of the slide out and set that aside. Take the screws off the top here. Don't lose your motor retention screw. You'll need that later. Using the jack and our hands, we're just simply going to slide this into the opening. Now if you look at this side, you'll notice this side is significantly out of square. So what we can do is we can actually take this, since I don't have the motor installed, and push this in. All right? Now if it doesn't fit, don't force it in. Take the opposite side loose, readjust that slide box, and then install the system. All right, so now I've got it installed. I've got it slid into position. I'm simply going to grab it, push the box in, making sure to push in on it just a little bit, get it started. Now I can come in and I can drop the motor in, put the motor retention screw back in, and use my jumper harness to go ahead and run it the rest of the way in. All right, so now I have my motor. I've got my jumper harness. I'm going to set my jumper harness up. I'm going to install the motor next. Now when you install the motor, what you want to have is you want to have this harness facing this sidewall, so I'm going to install it just like this. That way it gives the most clearance for when that slide out comes in or out, the actual harness is up and out of the way. So I can drop it in just like this. And I'm going to go around to the inside and get that adjusted and get that set into place. Okay, so now the motor's installed. I'm going to set this aside, grab my motor retention screw and a square bit. Put my square bit in. Take my motor retention screw in and install it into the hole provided. Once that's in place, I'll take the battery out. Grab my jumper harness, connect it. And now I can use this by reversing the polarity to go ahead and drive this system in. All right, so I'm just bumping this in. All right, I've got it in far enough to where I can get a screw in there to hold it in place. So I disconnect the harness. We'll set this aside. So screw at the top, screw at the bottom. Now I'm going to take my tape measure to ensure that I'm at that 2.5 inches plus or minus 1/8 inch. So I come in here, measure. That is 2.5 inches, and that one is 2.5 inches. So now that I have ensured that this is in spec, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the rest of the screws. All right, so now all I have to do is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to drop the jack, move that out of the way, come in, I'm going to reconnect the harness, ensure that I've got all my screws installed. I'm going to run the slide out in all the way. Now I'm going to go in on the inside and finish attaching all the screws to the upper and lower gear rack. All right, so we have the slide out reinstalled. We've got the Schwintek, it's been rebuilt, it's been retimed. The last thing to do is to resynchronize the slide out. So both sides, motor 1 and motor 2, close at about the same time. Our general recommendation is run that slide out a couple inches, bring it in, just like this. And then bring it in and hold down on the button for a 3 count. This ensures both sides, motor 1 and motor 2, have an opportunity to amp out at about the same time. Once that's done, simply run the room all the way out to ensure proper operation. All right, and then go ahead and retract it and you're done. Once again, like I stated at the beginning, make sure you know what type of shoe you're doing and you have on your system before you order the rebuild kit, because they are not interchangeable. The standard has to go with the standard and the inverted has to go with the inverted. All right, and that concludes how we do a Schwintek inverted gear rack rebuild kit.